Thrilled to welcome back to the program Michael Brooks. How's it doing, man?
Hey man, it's great to be talking with you. And not the best of times, but
No.
definitely can't complain obviously. But yeah, doing fine. How are
Yeah.
you doing?
Well, one thing that makes it easier is being able to talk to people you respect and admire, and thankfully, due to the power of the internet, we're able to do that. So,
Yes,
very
my
glad,
honor, man. Thank you.
very glad to have you back on. Obviously, if people are not familiar, host of the Michael Brooks Show, friend of this show, and also author. No big deal. But Against the Web, the cosmopolitan socialist answer to the new right. By the way, it's out. It's available. You can read it. We're going to be talking about it. I went to read the blurb on Amazon because I was told by one of my producers that it was written by Anna Kasparian. And as I was reading that, I noticed no big deal, but that your book was number one new release in political philosophy.
Which is cool. I mean, who knows how many people are buying political philosophy books, but I will say one of the things that feels good about that is I'm telling everybody, and I should say the working title was Cosmopolitan Socialist Answer, and they went with just Cosmopolitan, got rid of the Socialist. So in case you're looking it up, but I've been telling everybody to buy it at Red Emma's in Baltimore,
Mm-hmm.
which is a great worker cooperative owned bookstore. And I have a friend of mine over there who works there, and it's nice little shot in the arm during these times that people are ordering it from there. So I've been saying don't buy it at Amazon if it can be possibly avoided. So the fact that that's still doing
Yes.
well at Amazon, that's a nice signal, man. I think some people are buying it.
Exactly. Yeah, that should go without saying. I just like that Anna's thing was listed there.
Oh,
Um,
totally.
but I want to talk to you about the book because you delve into and lay out concise but all-encompassing arguments against the intellectual dark web. Prepping for this interview, I once again read part of the Barry Weiss "Meet the Renegades of the Intellectual Dark Web" article, and I was reminded that that is possibly the most embarrassing thing I've ever read on the New York Times. But anyway, tell
A
me,
lot of competition.
that's true. But this is pretty bad. So why the intellectual dark web?
Well, at the time in 2018, when I got asked to write the book, and definitely like the kind of brand has dissipated, and I think fortunately the book has a bigger argument about actually really like the nature of the left and how it could be better that transcends dealing with this particular group. But in 2018, they had a lot of traction, particularly in the world that we're in. I felt like they were sort of migrating people into politics that I didn't, necessarily agree with. But I also thought they were exploiting a lot of weaknesses that we could do better on, the left could do better on. And what really got me about them as a group, honestly, was not every this or that position that they had or thinking that everything they said was necessarily illegitimate, but just the totally ahistorical nature of all of it.
Mm-hmm.
And to me, I really, really think, and I think it's a big problem like across the board, that if we don't start to have a historical framework for understanding things, whether it's why does the United States not have single payer and other comparable countries have national health care, or how does our foreign policy relate to Islam as an example, or even why do we have such unprecedented alienation and inequality in some ways in the economy? What is that about? Like, what were the actual forces driving it? And I think that's also, by the way, some people complain. They say, like, these aren't right wing guys because, Sam Harris doesn't like Donald Trump or whatever. That wasn't the point. And my view is that any right wing project is a project that looks at the world as it is and basically says there's like immutable laws that make it so,
Mm-hmm.
right? Like there's scientific truths or mythological truths. That explain to you why things are as they are. And then they use a lot of like disanalogies to naturalize things like, whoa, you want to get rid of like extreme income inequality and profound imbalances in power between capital and labor. Well, I guess you think that kids should be able to, set their own bedtimes, or you want every NBA team to win the playoffs or every football team to get a ring. No, we make obvious distinctions here. And in fact, we want a society where we can enjoy competition and enjoy different outcomes that just aren't spilling over into whether or not people's like life expectancies are decreased, as an example.
Yeah. Yeah, so you talk about the need for us to understand our history, to understand the situation we're in, and presumably to figure out fixes to get to where we want to be. They in their arguments will say that they care about history, that they're hearkening back to some sort of mythic idea of what the United States was and should be again. Certainly Donald Trump in his rhetoric, he makes you think that that is what he's doing. But not to spoil some of what you reveal in the book, and I understand that everyone is going to say this about their political or philosophical rivals, but they don't strike me as people who actually care if what they're saying is true for the most part. Very often, like Dave Rubin doesn't seem to care if he's accurately reflecting the present, let alone the past. They have people on like Dinesh D'Souza who, like what he says about the KKK and the Civil War, like it's so divorced from reality. So does that, like, obviously didn't deter you from writing the book, but when you are putting out a historically grounded case designed to persuade against people who seem to be wholly unconcerned about whether what they're saying is factual or not, how does that affect the way that you try to make your case and potentially to appeal to people who haven't chosen sides?
Well, I will warn people that I don't spend that much time talking about Dave Rubin in the book. I mean, I have a little bit of fun with him, and he's fun to make fun of and whatever. But I try to take on
more intellectually serious members of the IDW.
Yeah, I mean, whatever you think of them, and I'm sure that Jordan Peterson and Sam Harris think that they are being very precise. And I actually, that's one thing I would not take from them. I think that it is sincere. I mean, obviously, I have fundamental structural disagreements, but I think that they have very sincerely held worldviews. Dave, I honestly just can't comment on. I don't even know if he understands what worldview means. But I think that, what is always interesting to me, and it's funny because I think we've sort of overlearned some of the lessons of electoral politics, which is that this obsession with swing voters is not a great way to understand how to build a successful and effective campaign and put forward, economic populist policy or make the case for civil rights or whatever. And I think that's true. But I actually think that in a funny way, when you're in media, you actually do need to be much more attentive to that, which is what are the group of people who they could come from a variety of different backgrounds, have different tendencies, but they are responding to style, they're responding to presentation, and they're also responding to ways of how you make your arguments. So I was sort of hoping, with the book is that if people are, I mean, I think, some people are going to obviously, plenty of people are buying it who already, like the work I do. They're probably sympathetic to this. And I think what the book does, hopefully, is this idea of cosmopolitan socialism is a different spin on how to frame left-wing politics, which I think is effective and interesting, hopefully, for people. But I think for people who are outside of it, and I do get, and I do interviews and talk to people who are not necessarily like IDW people or whatever, but they're definitely not on the left. They might really have sympathy for some of these people. And when they see how I'm putting together arguments, and it's not just, somebody saying like, oh, you like these guys, you're a bad person, or, this person said X, Y, and Z, and that's problematic, and blah, 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 blah. They actually are like, whoa, you actually do probably seem like you have a pretty good grasp on this stuff. And maybe I have to actually really rethink how this information is being presented to me. And it's funny because on the history thing, I don't know about Dinesh D'Souza, I'm sure has probably been on Rubin's show, I would imagine, but the only one of them that really talks, I mean, Peterson talks about the West as some type of, kind of philosophical concept, which is really shaky. But, Ben Shapiro, who really is just a standard right-wing talk show host, in my opinion, and the fact that he's part of this scene says a lot. But his book is supposedly this historical rendering of Western society and this marriage of Athens and Jerusalem. And I got to tell you, if you're going to say that there's an uninterrupted Western history that connects Greek and Hebraic thought, it's a pretty big problem. And forget, being PC. I'm talking like doing your work and checking your notes to skip Islamic history. Like that just isn't going to work.
Yeah.
So, that's definitely, I mean, it's hard not to see an ideological motivation in that.
Yeah, definitely. And a financial one, of course, because they're quite successful, both in their own right. But also You know, this steps a little bit away from the particular topic that you're covering in the book, but you host a show and you've written a book. It's very well received. I host a show. We have this like ecosystem of this sort of content. The right has that too, and the rise of the IDW sort of went along with the rise of the success of conservatives on YouTube and things like that, and certainly they're writing books and selling them too. Along the way, though, it seems like there has been a lot of institutional and elite support for one side of that, in terms of bulk buys of books and huge investments in media companies and things like that. I don't know of anything like that on the left. Does it matter? Are we missing out much on that? Would it be nice to have something supporting us? Like, for instance, I know Ben Shapiro's show, the advertising it receives on Facebook is in the millions of dollars a year range, which is something, it seems like. What do you think about that, about the difference in outside support for these competing ecosystems?
Well, I think three quick things. I think sometimes, honestly, like, look, it's 100% right. And it's sort of, it's baked into the cake. I think sometimes the left has used that absolutely correct take to not look at how we can be better and more appealing in some ways, which I don't want to, I think it's important to not use it like that. On the other hand, I think, look, there, especially if you're doing any type of, say, like labor oriented, like anywhere from like genuinely progressive, let alone like kind of Marxist content, right? I mean, there is a structural contradiction between venture capital being interested in producing that kind of work, right?
Yeah.
And literally the content. So I think that that's part of the playing field. And I think, that's obviously reflected in politics. You have mega donors that will support like, a white identitarian politics party that supports oligarch policies with the Republicans. And then it will support Democrats who, may have a certain superficial commitment to some aspects of, representation of diversity, some of which, on a legal level are extremely important, but have no, don't want to do anything structural about, just mass inequality and mass disparity. And so I think that that's going to be something we always run up against, that you can. And it's also interesting to me, too, that I don't think necessarily, like, I think that people like us, I don't think would be candidates, frankly, for funding from those sources regardless. But it's interesting to me that when you read about Republican funders versus Democratic mega funders, the Republican funders are actually a lot more generous and a lot more strategic and seem to be much less ego driven. Like, you have like Bloomberg and Steyer have basically just kind of like completely defanged the environmental movement, in my estimation, kind of return, basically like just sort of like giant clubs for their funding. And that's, I think, undermined the efficacy of some environmental organizations. And then you think of like, just, like Steyer running for president, right? Like, why? Why is his self-expression so important? And then like, the evil Kochs, yeah, the guy did a silly run in 1980, but they have spent decades slowly and methodically just seeding people and seeding organizations and really taking a long-term view. And it's interesting that there's more capacity to do that on the right than in the center in terms of oligarchs. But I just think at the end of the day, if your politics really comes down to like, yeah, you shouldn't be a billionaire. I don't care how of a nice guy you are, or if you tested well, or if you were at the right place at the right time. And I'm not even saying you shouldn't have, sure, you can have a nice life or whatever, and sure, but that level of wealth and influence is never going to be compatible with democracy. And I'm not totally sure why they would be stoked to fund that message.
Yeah. Even the individuals who might be like, oh, when I die, I'm giving it all away. That's later. Right now, I want it. I want to keep it. Okay, so moving to solutions, obviously that's the book. We don't want to spoil that. We want people to go and take a look at the book. But what's one thing that we can do to be better, both as individuals, someone watching this video maybe who's following this content, who's, you know, arguing online, engaging with politics, or me. I host a show. What can I do to be a little bit better?
Wow. I mean, Jesus, I don't know, a little bit better. I don't know about all that. I would say that we have to really, what concerns me sometimes right now, and definitely with like a lot of liberal politics, when they talk about, you know, like the Trump voters or whatever, sometimes there is a tendency to recreate bad ideas and bad ways of doing things from the past. So I'll just say this. I remember kind of coming into politics in some ways after and around the time of the September 11th terrorist attacks. And this was a time in the country where it would, you know, anybody could be able to understand that obviously that action was a crime against humanity and a travesty. And also that we needed to understand what had led up to it, ideologically, politically, historically, and so on. And the mainstream reactionary view from all of the corporate press and from all Republicans and a vast majority of Democrats was that to even have that conversation somehow validated the terrorists. And I got to say, in a much different way, like, I'm sorry, just saying that Jordan Peterson is wrong all day isn't going to do anything. What are the needs he's speaking to? What are the problems that he's addressing? I disagree vehemently with, obviously, a lot of his frameworks and solutions, but to pretend that he isn't speaking to real and valid things is strategically disastrous, and actually the moralism of it starts to remind me of, you know, George W. Bush kind of stuff. So I think that we should recognize that understanding the why of something is not a justification for it, and in fact, it's the only way of beginning to address it. And that requires some sophistication and some empathy.
I agree. Man, I immediately start to think of, you know, what do we insert as an alternative, and it's complicated because some of what I see as, like, when you look at the sort of people that have become popular, what are they advertising as? This is why you should follow me, or this is why you should be part of the movement. I certainly agree that there are those needs. Some of the stuff that they offer, though, like the elevation of trolling over the past few years as like the end in politics. Obviously, it's a distraction. They're confirming judges and giving tax breaks and things like that. But that's the bread and circuses and all of that is identifying groups that I don't like and making them feel bad, and that is what politics should deliver. Whew, man, it's difficult to think about. But anyway, I'm glad that there are people like you doing that thinking.
I mean, I appreciate it. And again, I'd even distinguish, like, I actually think when we start to make these distinctions, we can actually get much clearer about some of the stuff that does just need to be, you know, torn apart or honestly made irrelevant by the right kind of approach. But I mean, of course, I agree with you. I think that obviously that stuff is disgusting. Yeah. But how we feed it or don't feed it and deal with it is another set of questions.
I agree. And I assume in further books will be delved into even further. But for right now, what is available is Against the Web, available in a variety of places, both online places that you probably should not get it from, and also better places that you should. But Michael, we need warriors, and I'm glad that you're one of them out there fighting this battle, both every day in your show, but also in the books. Everybody, take a look at that.
Thank you so much, man. Really appreciate it. Stay safe.
You too. Check out the Damage Report podcast each day, wherever you get your podcasts, whether Pocket Casts or Stitcher or iTunes. You can join me as I give you the news and stories you want, with a range of co-hosts and interview guests jumping in on the fun each day. Again, that's the Damage Report, wherever you get your podcasts. And if you get them at iTunes, don't forget to rate and review. Sometimes I'll read them live on the show.